In the first week of July 1944, the United States Army had a problem that nobody had planned for. The Army had crossed the English Channel. It had survived the beaches. It had fought its way inland through June against German defenders who used every ditch, every village, every road junction as a position to be taken at cost. The losses had been heavy, but the Army had moved. The beachhead had become a lodgment. The lodgment had become a front, and the front was supposed to keep moving. It had stopped. Not from a German counterattack, not from a failure of supply or a collapse of command. The Army had been stopped by the landscape of Normandy itself, by a feature of the French countryside that the planners in London had noted on their maps and categorized as difficult terrain, without fully understanding what difficult terrain meant when you were trying to move armor through it at the pace a campaign required. The feature was called bocage. The word is French, and it describes a specific kind of agricultural landscape. Small fields enclosed by dense earthen banks topped with shrubs, trees, and vegetation that had been growing and compressing for centuries. The banks themselves were not hedges in any English-language sense of the word. They were walls, earthen ramparts between 3 and 10 feet high, between 2 and 4 feet thick at the base, with root systems that had been binding the soil for generations. A bocage bank was not something you pushed through with your hands. It was not something you drove a jeep through. It was barely something you drove a tank through, and when you tried, the tank exposed the thing that the planners had not adequately considered, its belly. A Sherman tank's armor was distributed according to the threats it expected to face. The frontal armor was thick enough to absorb most of what German anti-tank weapons could deliver at medium range. The side armor was thinner, but still functional. The top armor was minimal. The designers had not expected threats from above. And the bottom armor, the floor of the hull, the underside of the vehicle, was the thinnest of all, because the designers had not expected the tank to need protection from below. They had not expected the bocage. When a Sherman attempted to cross a bocage bank by climbing over it, the only method available in the absence of a gate or a gap, the tank's nose went up as it mounted the bank. The hull tilted forward at an angle that could reach 30 or 40 degrees. The underside of the vehicle, with its thin belly armor, rose above the crest of the bank and became visible to anyone on the other side who was waiting with an anti-tank weapon. At that angle, the tank's gun, the weapon that was supposed to protect the crew, pointed uselessly skyward, unable to engage anything on the ground. The tank was blind and exposed simultaneously. German soldiers were waiting. They had been in Normandy since the Atlantic Wall was built. They knew the bocage because they lived in it, defended in it, and had spent weeks since June 6th learning exactly where to position a Panzerfaust team or a towed anti-tank gun to catch a Sherman at the moment its belly was exposed. The moment lasted only a few seconds, the time it took for the tank to rock forward over the crest of the bank. Those few seconds were enough. A Panzerfaust round striking the belly armor of a Sherman at close range did not merely damage the tank, it destroyed it. The thin steel of the hull floor offered no meaningful resistance to a shape charge fired at a range of 30 or 40 meters. The fuel and ammunition inside the tank did the rest. The crews who survived described the speed of the fire, the way a tank that had been a moving, fighting vehicle became a burning wreck in the time it took to understand what had happened. The historian Stephen Zaloga, the leading expert on American armor in the Second World War, estimated that American tank crews in Normandy suffered an 80% casualty rate during the summer campaign. 80%. The figure included men killed, wounded, and captured across the entire summer's fighting, and it included losses to all causes, to German tanks, to anti-tank guns, to artillery, to the Panzerfaust teams in the bocage banks. But the bocage contributed disproportionately to the toll, because the bocage removed from the Sherman the tactical mobility that was its primary advantage over a defensive opponent. A Sherman in open country was dangerous. A Sherman in bocage was a target with a predictable route. The crews who survived attributed their survival, in significant measure, to luck, to the specific chance that the Panzerfaust team on the other side of the bank had fired slightly late or slightly wide, or had already been suppressed by the infantry moving alongside the tank. They did not attribute their survival to superior tactics or better equipment. They attributed it to the specific randomness of combat in terrain where the advantage belonged to the man who was already there. The bocage was not the only problem. The lanes between the fields, the sunken roads that connected one enclosed space to another, were so narrow that a Sherman moving through them was channeled into a single file from which lateral movement was impossible. A tank in a sunken lane could not turn. It could not maneuver. It could only move forward or backward, and a well-placed German anti-tank gun at the end of a lane could stop the entire column with a single shot at the lead vehicle. The sunken lanes had been cut into the Norman landscape over centuries by the passage of farm vehicles and animals, and they were below the level of the surrounding fields, which meant that the banks on either side rose above the tank's turret ring, blocking the view and preventing the tank from engaging targets outside the lane itself. A column of Shermans moving through a sunken lane was, from the German perspective, a column of vehicles moving in a channel from which they could not escape, visible from above but unable to see what was above them. The bocage turned every field into a fortress and every lane into a kill zone. By the first week of July, the maps in Bradley's headquarters showed a front that had barely moved in days. The divisions that were supposed to be pushing south toward St. Lo were grinding forward at rates measured in hundreds of yards. Casualties were accumulating at a pace that the replacement system was struggling to match. The infantry replacement pool, the men being shipped from the United States to fill the spaces left by the dead and wounded, was being consumed faster than it was being built. The writer William Arendt, who served in Normandy and wrote about the hedgerow fighting in his memoir Midnight of the Soul, described bocage combat as the toughest in the world, with the possible exception of close-contact jungle warfare. The comparison was not rhetorical. The bocage shared with jungle terrain the quality of reducing the effective range of every weapon to the width of the space you were in, turning a campaign that was supposed to use American material superiority and mobility into a series of individual engagements where the defender's knowledge of the ground mattered more than the attacker's equipment. The men in the hedgerows had been fighting for a month and were showing the specific exhaustion of men who are dying for small pieces of ground that do not seem worth what they are costing. Division commanders were filing reports that described the same problem in different language but with consistent content. Inability to advance at acceptable cost, terrain that negated armor, German defensive positions that were destroyed one by one only to be replaced by new positions 100 yards back. The army was not losing, it was not winning, it was stuck. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 1st United States Army, responsible for the campaign that was supposed to break out of Normandy and drive across France, was looking for a solution to a problem that his planning staff had not fully anticipated and that his engineers had not yet solved. The frustration in Bradley's headquarters was visible in the operational maps that showed week after week of minimal advance and in the casualty figures that accompanied them. The solution was not going to come from his planning staff or his engineers. It was going to come from a sergeant in the 2nd Armored Division who had been listening to a joke that nobody else found funny. The Normandy bocage appeared on every Allied planning map produced before the invasion. It appeared as a terrain feature, a notation that the landscape in the American sector was characterized by enclosed fields and dense vegetation that would limit vehicle movement and visibility. The planners had read it, categorized it, and moved on. They had other problems. The beaches had to be crossed. The coastal defenses had to be breached. The German armored reserves had to be contained while the beachhead was established. The bocage was a secondary concern. Difficult terrain that experienced soldiers would manage as they had managed difficult terrain before. The planners had not been in the bocage. The men who had been in similar terrain were the veterans of the Italian campaign, officers and soldiers who had spent 1943 fighting through the hills and villages of Sicily and mainland Italy against German defenders who used every feature of the landscape with the same systematic intelligence that the Normandy defenders would demonstrate. Some of those veterans had submitted reports. The reports described terrain that favored the defender and degraded the attacker's ability to use armor effectively. The reports had been read. They had not been translated into a solution before the Army landed. The specific failure of the pre-invasion planning was not an absence of information about the bocage. It was an absence of the imaginative specificity required to turn topographical notation into tactical preparation. The maps showed enclosed fields. They did not convey the experience of standing in an enclosed field and understanding that you could not see the next field, that the bank between you and the next field was a wall rather than a hedge, that the wall was a defensive position that the Germans had been preparing since the fall of France in 1940. The first American units to move inland from the beaches encountered the bocage on June 7th, one day after D-Day. The initial engagements were confused, costly, and instructive in the way that only direct experience can be instructive. A company commander who had trained his men on the open plains of England, who had rehearsed attack formations on ground where you could see across the battlefield, suddenly found himself commanding in a landscape where the next field was invisible until you were in it, and the Germans had been waiting for you since morning. The lessons accumulated quickly. Moving along bocage lanes meant moving in single file, slowly, with the lead vehicle as bait for whatever was waiting around the bend. Moving across open fields, the alternative to the lanes, meant crossing ground that the Germans had registered for artillery fire, and that was covered by machine guns positioned in the banks on the far side. There was no good option. There was only the choice of which bad option to take. The tanks were central to the problem and unable to solve it. A Sherman tank in bocage country was simultaneously essential and nearly useless. Essential because the infantry needed the tank's gun and armor to suppress the German positions that controlled movement across the fields. Nearly useless because the tank could not cross the bocage banks without exposing its belly, could not move through the lanes without being channeled into a column that a single anti-tank weapon could stop, and could not see or fire effectively at ranges greater than the width of a single field, perhaps 150 meters at most and often less. The relationship between infantry and armor in the bocage was a study in mutual dependency and mutual inadequacy. The infantry needed the tank's firepower to suppress the German positions that controlled the fields. The tank needed the infantry's close protection to prevent the Panzerfaust teams from getting close enough to fire. Without the tank, the infantry was pinned. Without the infantry, the tank was blind and vulnerable. Together, moving in the careful coordination that bocage combat demanded, they could take a field, one field, and then the next field had the same problem. The engineers tried solutions. They brought up bulldozers to push through the banks. The bulldozers were slow, conspicuous, and easily targeted. German gunners learned quickly that destroying the bulldozer denied the Americans their gap-making capability and adjusted their fire accordingly. They used explosives to blow holes in the banks. The explosions were effective at creating openings but announced the intention to cross at that point, giving the German defenders time to reposition before the armor moved through. Other units tried improvised devices. Angled blades welded to tank fronts, steel rails attached at various angles, different configurations of cutting edges designed to bite into the bank rather than climb over it. Some of these worked partially, in specific conditions with specific bank structures. None of them worked consistently enough or quickly enough to change the fundamental tactical situation. The problem was that every solution took time. In bocage, time was what you did not have. The German defender, dug in, concealed, with pre-planned fields of fire, could respond to an American gap-making effort faster than the effort could produce a gap. By the time the gap existed, the position waiting on the other side had been reinforced. By the time the reinforced position had been suppressed, the attack had lost the momentum and surprise that made it possible. The Army needed a solution that was fast, faster than the German response, fast enough to cross a bocage bank before the defender on the other side had time to aim. By early July, dozens of improvised solutions were being tried across the American sector. Units experimented with different attachment designs for their tanks: metal prongs, angled blades, various forms of cutting edges welded to the fronts of Shermans by field maintenance crews working from whatever steel was available. Most of the designs worked partially. None of them worked well enough, reliably enough, to be adopted across the force. The solution that worked came from a suggestion that began as a joke. The discussion happened in early July 1944 in a field somewhere in the American sector of Normandy. The specific date is not recorded. The specific field is not identified. What is recorded, in the account preserved by the military historian Max Hastings, who interviewed participants and reviewed the documents, is the substance of what was said and the identity of the man who said it. The man was described, in the accounts that have come down through the historical record, as a Tennessee hillbilly named Roberts. The description was not intended as a compliment by the men who used it, and the tone of the discussion made clear that Roberts was not considered, by his peers in that particular moment, a serious contributor to the technical problem the unit was trying to solve. He was the kind of soldier who said things that made other soldiers laugh. Not because he was stupid, but because the directness of his thinking bypassed the professional filters that military training installs. Roberts said, "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" The room, or the field, or wherever the discussion was happening, responded with laughter. Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen III did not laugh. Cullen was 29 years old, a native of Cranford, New Jersey, serving with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron of the 2nd Armored Division. He was not an engineer. He was not a designer. He had no formal training in vehicle modification or mechanical systems beyond what his military service had provided. He was a cavalry reconnaissance soldier, a man whose job was to find the enemy, assess the situation, and report back, not to redesign the vehicles he was riding in. He was also a man who understood, from weeks of fighting in the bocage, exactly what problem Roberts had just described a solution for. The problem was the angle. When a Sherman climbed a bocage bank, the tank's nose rose and the belly exposed itself. The solution Roberts had inadvertently identified was to not climb the bank at all, to drive through it instead. The bank was dirt. Dense, root-bound, centuries-compressed dirt, but dirt. Steel teeth welded to the nose of a Sherman, angled downward and forward, would dig into the base of the bank before the tank's hull rose. The tank would push through rather than climb over. The belly would stay level. The exposure would be eliminated. It was a solution so simple that it seemed obvious in retrospect. It was not obvious before Roberts stated it, and even after he stated it, the laughter in the room demonstrated that the connection between the casual suggestion and the engineering solution was not immediately apparent to the men who heard it. What Roberts had described was not a sophisticated mechanism or a complex modification. It was a different way of approaching the bank, from the bottom rather than from the top. Cullen took the idea to his officers. He did not present it as Roberts' idea or as a concept discussed informally in a field. He presented it as a concrete proposal with a specific implementation. Steel teeth welded to the front of a Sherman, cutting into the base of the bocage bank at ground level, allowing the tank to push through without climbing. He had thought through the geometry. The teeth needed to be angled downward enough to bite into the earth below the root mass, not so angled that they would deflect upward on impact. They needed to be heavy enough to withstand the force of a tank driving at combat speed into a dense earthen bank. They needed to be positioned at the corners of the hull as well as the center, so that the tank's full frontal width could engage the bank simultaneously. His officers were skeptical. The idea was simple. Simple was not always a recommendation in military procurement, which tended toward complexity and formal testing procedures. Simple could also mean fragile or ineffective under the specific conditions of Normandy's bocage, which varied considerably in density and root structure from field to field. Cullen asked for the materials to build a prototype. The materials were available without requesting a supply shipment. They were sitting on the beaches of Normandy, left there by the Germans who had placed them in 1942 and 1943 to impede exactly the kind of amphibious landing that had just succeeded in getting past them. The German beach obstacles, the Czech hedgehogs, the steel tetrahedra, the angled iron beams designed to rip open the hulls of landing craft, had been cleared from the beach lanes by engineers in the first days after D-Day. The cleared obstacles had been stacked in piles along the beach and in the fields immediately behind it. They were scrap metal, waiting for whatever use could be found for them. The irony was precise. The steel that the Germans had placed to stop the invasion would now be used to defeat the defenses that had survived the invasion. Cullen and his crew cut the steel from several German beach obstacles into 4 heavy prongs and welded them to the front of a Sherman. The work was done by the unit's maintenance welders, men who spent their days repairing battle damage to vehicles and who could execute a field modification like this as a matter of routine. The fabrication took a few hours. The result was not elegant. The prongs were rough-cut, the welds were functional rather than fine, and the device looked like what it was, something made in a field from scrap metal. But it looked like it would work. The prototype was tested against a bocage bank. The tank drove at the bank at combat speed. The prongs hit the base of the bank at ground level. They dug into the earth and root mass. The tank pushed through. The hull stayed level. The belly armor remained pointed at the ground. The tank emerged from the bank on the other side in approximately the time it would have taken to traverse the same distance on open ground. Nobody laughed. The silence after the prototype demonstration was the specific silence of men who have just seen a problem that was killing their comrades solved in an afternoon. One officer who was present described looking at the tank emerging from the bank, hull level, gun forward, moving at speed, and understanding that what he was watching was different from anything he had seen in 7 weeks of bocage fighting. Not a partial solution, not an improvement, a solution. The device was demonstrated to progressively senior officers. The demonstrations produced the same result each time: a Sherman crossing a bocage bank at speed, without climbing, without exposing its belly, without slowing to allow the defenders on the other side time to adjust. The officers who watched the demonstrations asked the same questions. How long does it take to fabricate? What materials are needed? How many tanks can be equipped? The answers were the right answers. Fabrication took a few hours per tank, using scrap steel from the beach obstacles that were sitting in piles along the Normandy coast. The only specialized equipment required was a welder, which every armored maintenance unit had. The number of tanks that could be equipped was limited primarily by the availability of welders and the time before the next offensive. The demonstrations reached General Omar Bradley. Bradley watched the Sherman push through the bocage bank and said, according to the accounts preserved in the Army's official history, that the device would probably revolutionize warfare in the Normandy section of France. He was not given to hyperbole. He was a methodical, understated commander who chose his words carefully and whose assessments were valued precisely because they were not inflated by the enthusiasm of the moment. He ordered production to begin immediately. Bradley's order created an immediate organizational challenge. The Army needed to produce Cullen cutters, as the device was already being called after its inventor, in the largest possible numbers in the shortest possible time. The raw material was the German beach obstacles, which existed in sufficient quantity along the Normandy coast to equip every tank in the First Army several times over. The manufacturing requirement was welding, skilled but not specialized, available in every armored maintenance unit in the theater. The design was simple enough that each unit could fabricate its own devices from the same basic pattern, adapting dimensions as needed for different tank variants. The production proceeded across the First Army's maintenance units simultaneously, without waiting for centralized procurement or standardized manufacture. Cullen's original T1 device, 4 prongs welded to a mounting plate, became the basis for a family of variations that different units developed independently as they adapted the concept to their specific vehicles and conditions. The 3rd Armored Division produced its own T2 Douglas device, identifiable by the triangular plates welded to the sides of the prong assembly. The plates increased the device's structural rigidity and improved its ability to push aside the root mass of the bocage banks without deflecting. The T3 was a lighter version, designed for the M5A1 Stuart light tank, the smallest American armored vehicle that needed to cross bocage banks, and was the most fragile of the Rhino designs. The T4 Rhinoceros device used a different cutting geometry that was better at pushing aside lighter brush, but less effective against the dense, ancient root systems of genuine Norman bocage. Each device was manufactured by hand, by individual welders working from the basic principle rather than from standardized blueprints. The result was that no two Cullen cutters were identical. The quality varied with the skill of the welder and the quality of the scrap steel available. A device fabricated from heavy-gauge German hedgehog steel by a skilled maintenance welder was substantially more durable than one made from lighter scrap by a less experienced crew. The variation was accepted as the cost of rapid field manufacture. Imperfect devices that worked were preferable to perfect devices that did not exist. The devices spread from tanks to tank destroyers to self-propelled guns to Stuart light tanks. Any vehicle that needed to cross bocage and could support the weight of the attachment got one. The First Army's Ordnance Section supervised the distribution to ensure that tanks were equipped first, before the attachments were extended to other vehicle types, because the tanks were the primary tactical problem. The vehicles whose inability to cross bocage banks was most directly limiting the Army's ability to advance. By the time the numbers were counted, 3 out of every 5 tanks in the First Army carried a Cullen cutter. 3 out of 5. In less than 3 weeks, from a single sergeant's prototype built from German beach scrap, the Army had modified the majority of its tank force to address the problem that had been killing it since June. The scale of the modification effort was itself a demonstration of the American military's ability to convert a field innovation into a force-wide capability without the formal procurement procedures that such a modification would have required in peacetime. Bradley made one decision that demonstrated his understanding of what the device was worth. He forbade its use until Operation Cobra. This was not a cautious or bureaucratic decision. It was a precise calculation about the value of tactical surprise and the cost of revealing a capability before the moment when that capability could be decisive. The Cullen cutter's effectiveness depended not only on its mechanical function, crossing bocage banks without exposing the belly, but on the German defenders not knowing it existed. A German defender who knew that American tanks could push through bocage banks at combat speed could adjust. He could reposition his anti-tank weapons to cover not the tops of the banks, where he was currently positioned to engage climbing tanks, but the bases, where the Rhino's prongs would emerge and where the tank would be for the seconds before it pushed through. He could position Panzerfaust teams in the fields with instructions to engage tanks coming through the banks rather than over them. He could mine the bases of the banks at the most likely crossing points. None of these adjustments was impossibly difficult. They were the kind of tactical adaptation that experienced German defenders made routinely. But they required time to understand the new threat, time to issue new instructions, time to reposition weapons and personnel, time that Bradley was not going to give them. The Cullen cutters were fabricated in the rear areas and moved forward, but the modified tanks were held back from the bocage fighting. The July battles, the grinding, costly advance toward St. Lo, continued with the same methods that had been producing the same results since June. The infantry pushed forward, the tanks followed. The bocage extracted its price. The front moved in hundreds of yards. The men fighting those battles did not know about the device waiting in the rear. They did not know that 3 out of 5 of the tanks that would join the next offensive had been modified to solve the problem that was killing them. They knew what they could see: the bocage, the sunken lanes, the charred Shermans that accumulated in the fields as evidence of the cost of the summer's fighting. Bradley knew what they did not know. He waited. Operation Cobra was scheduled for July 25, 1944. Its objective was to break out of the bocage country entirely, not to push forward a mile or two in the grinding attrition that had characterized June and July, but to punch through the German line at a specific point near St. Lo, pour through the gap, and drive south and west into the open country beyond the bocage, where American armor could operate at the speed and scale it had been designed for. The sector chosen for the breakthrough was held by the German 84th Corps, a formation that had been fighting continuously since June 6th, and that, like the American units opposing it, was showing the specific strain of 7 weeks of bocage warfare. The German defenders were experienced, well-positioned, and had prepared their sector with the thoroughness that characterized German defensive engineering. They had also been doing it in a landscape that rewarded the defender, and they had every reason to believe that the landscape would continue to reward them as it had rewarded them since D-Day. They did not know about the Rhino tanks. The Rhino tanks would lead the breakout. The Germans would see American tanks crossing bocage banks at combat speed for the first time on July 25th. By the time they had processed what they were seeing and begun to adjust, the tanks would already be through. The bombardment that opened Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944, was the largest concentration of air power applied to a ground target in the history of warfare to that point. Approximately 1,500 B-17 and B-25 heavy bombers, followed by medium bombers and fighter bombers, dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs on a strip of German-held territory roughly 5 miles wide and 1 mile deep along the St. Lo Highway. The target area contained the German 84th Corps. The bombardment lasted several hours and produced the specific landscape that the official history described as a moonscape, a surface of overlapping craters from which all recognizable terrain features had been erased. The bombing was not without cost to the American side. The proximity of Allied forces to the target area and errors in the bomb release points of some formations meant that American units were struck by bombs intended for German positions. The casualties from friendly fire, 111 dead and nearly 500 wounded, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the senior American ground forces commander in the theater, were a significant and painful component of the operation's opening. The men who survived the friendly fire continued their advance. When the bombardment lifted, the American ground forces moved. They moved differently than they had moved in June and July. The Rhino tanks, 3 out of every 5 Shermans in the assault formations, drove at the bocage banks along the axis of advance and pushed through them. The prongs hit the base of the bank. The tank drove forward. The bank gave way. The tank emerged on the other side at the same level it had entered, hull level, belly down, gun pointing forward. The German defenders who had survived the bombardment, dazed, disoriented, their communications cut, and their command structure disrupted by the cratering of every recognizable landmark, saw American tanks coming through the bocage banks. Not over them, through them. The experience of watching a Sherman push through a bocage bank at combat speed was, for the Germans who witnessed it on July 25th, something without precedent in 7 weeks of Normandy fighting. They had spent 7 weeks adjusting their weapons, their positions, and their tactics to the specific vulnerability of a Sherman climbing a bank, the few seconds of exposed belly, the useless gun pointed skyward, the predictable moment of maximum vulnerability. That vulnerability had been their primary tactical tool against American armor in the bocage. It was gone. The tactical adjustment that Bradley had denied the Germans time to make, repositioning weapons to cover the likely crossing points, preparing the banks against a device they now knew existed, was impossible to make in real time, under fire, with the communications and command structure that the bombardment had left. The defenders who tried to engage the Rhino tanks as they emerged from the banks found that the few seconds of exposure they had trained and positioned to exploit were no longer available. The tank was not climbing. It was not tilting. It was pushing through at ground level and emerging already oriented, already moving, already covering the ground between the bank and the next position. The German tanks, Panthers and Panzer IVs that had been the primary armored threat to American advances throughout June and July, were constrained to the roads. This constraint was not a product of the Kulin cutter. It was a constraint that the bocage had imposed on all armor from the beginning of the campaign, and that German armor had managed by positioning itself on roads, and in the few areas of more open ground near Caen, where the British and Canadians were absorbing the majority of the German armored force. In the American sector, German armor on roads was stationary, or nearly so, unable to maneuver off the roads for the same reason that American armor had been unable to maneuver off the roads. The Kulin cutter had changed one side of that equation. While German tanks stayed on the roads, American rhinos crossed the fields. Not just the fields along the pre-planned axis of advance, but fields in the flanking sectors, fields that the German defensive plan had not assigned as priority targets because no armor had previously been able to cross them. The Rhino tanks moved through the bocage at angles that bypassed the road-oriented German defensive positions, emerging in sectors that had not been reinforced because they had not previously been threatened by armor. The asymmetry was decisive. Bradley's 5th Corps, led by the Rhino tanks of the armored spearhead, pushed through the German line and into the open country beyond the bocage. Within hours, the front that had been measured in hundreds of yards of daily advance was moving in miles. Within days, the breakout that the entire Normandy campaign had been building toward was in progress. The German line had not merely been pushed back, it had been breached, and through the breach, Patton's Third Army was pouring into the French countryside, where it could do what it had been built to do. The German 84th Corps, already degraded by the bombardment, was unable to reconstitute a coherent defensive line against a force that was moving through terrain the defensive plan had assumed was impassable. Reserves that were moved up to seal the breach found themselves outflanked by Rhino tanks, moving through bocage that the reserve's own vehicles could not follow them through. The collapse of the German line in the American sector accelerated through the last days of July and into August as the Third Army exploited the gap. The Rhino tanks were not the only reason Operation Cobra succeeded. The bombardment that preceded the ground assault had destroyed the German defensive capacity in the target sector to a degree that no infantry or armor assault could have achieved independently. The coordination between air and ground, imperfect, costly in friendly casualties, but ultimately effective, was the operational achievement that made the breakout possible. The infantry that followed the Rhino tanks through the bocage gaps cleared the positions that the tanks bypassed, securing the flanks of the advance and preventing the German defenders from reconsolidating. But the bocage had been the constraint that made a breakout seem impossibly difficult through 7 weeks of June and July fighting. Not the only constraint, but the one that defined the tactical problem at the most basic level, the problem that every plan for advancing had to solve before any other problem could be addressed. The Rhino tank was what removed that constraint. Not gradually, not incrementally, but on a single day, July 25, 1944, when 3 out of 5 American tanks in the First Army pushed through the bocage banks for the first time, and the German defenders saw something they had not seen before and had not prepared for. Curtis Cullen received the Legion of Merit for his invention. The ceremony was modest by the standards of what the device had contributed. The Legion of Merit was the 4th highest military decoration, significant but not the Distinguished Service Cross or the Medal of Honor that the popular imagination associated with decisive contributions to a campaign. It was the decoration given for exceptional service, and what Cullen had provided was exceptional service, a specific practical solution to a problem that was costing the First Army its momentum and its men. Eisenhower personally acknowledged the Cullen cutter in his post-war memoir Crusade in Europe, describing it as a critical innovation in the Normandy campaign. Bradley's official history noted the device with the emphasis it deserved. 3 out of 5 tanks modified in 3 weeks, from a sergeant's prototype to a force-wide capability. The official histories of the First Army recorded that the Rhino tank's surprise effect on the opening day of Cobra was a significant contributor to the speed of the initial breakthrough. Cullen died in 1963 at the age of 48. He did not live to see the full historical assessment of what he had contributed. His name appears in the technical histories and the unit records and the official histories of the Normandy campaign. It does not appear in the popular histories the way the names of the generals appear: Bradley, Patton, Eisenhower, because the popular history of a campaign is built around the decisions made at the command level, and the decisions made by sergeants in the field, however decisive, are harder to attach to outcomes at the scale a popular history requires. Roberts, the Tennessee hillbilly whose offhand remarks started everything, is even harder to find in the record. His full name has not been definitively established. He appears in Max Hastings' account as the source of the original idea, and he appears in other accounts in the same way, as the man who said the thing that became the solution, in a tone that made everyone in the room assume he was joking. He received no decoration. He has no Wikipedia entry. The idea that he expressed casually and without apparent awareness that he was expressing anything important changed the course of the Normandy campaign. What the Rhino tank story illuminates, in the specific way that military history illuminates things when you follow the evidence rather than the command hierarchy, is the mechanism through which armies solve problems that their planning did not anticipate. The bocage had not been anticipated, not adequately. The planners had noted it. They had not solved it before the army landed, because solving it required knowing exactly what the problem was, and knowing exactly what the problem was required being in it. The army landed, entered the bocage, and discovered the problem at the cost of 7 weeks and thousands of casualties. Then a sergeant listened to a joke. The joke was not a joke. It was a description of a solution, informal, imprecise, offered by a man who did not know that he was solving anything. Roberts had identified the correct answer to the bocage problem in a single sentence. "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" The answer was obvious once stated. It was not obvious before it was stated, and it required someone in the audience to hear the statement not as a joke, but as an engineering proposal, to filter out the laughter and extract the principle. Cullen did that. He took an informal suggestion from a soldier nobody was taking seriously and turned it into a prototype in hours, a demonstration in days, a force-wide capability in weeks. The process from Roberts' suggestion to 3 and 5 Rhino tanks was less than a month. The process from the first bocage engagement on June 7th to the Rhino tanks solving it on July 25th was 48 days. 48 days. From problem to solution, at a cost measured in weeks and in the lives of men who were fighting without the solution while it was being built. The German Army's equivalent process, identifying a tactical problem in the field, developing a response, manufacturing the modified equipment, distributing it to the units that needed it, was measured in months. Not because German soldiers were less observant or German engineers less capable. The German army had demonstrated throughout the war an ability to produce innovative solutions to tactical problems. The shaped charge Panzerfaust that had been killing Shermans in the bocage was itself a field innovation, a lightweight, disposable anti-tank weapon that any infantryman could carry and fire. The STG-44 assault rifle, the first production assault rifle, had been developed and fielded despite Hitler's initial opposition, through the specific persistence of the officers who believed in it. The difference was in the distribution mechanism. A German unit commander in Normandy who developed an innovative solution to a tactical problem could implement it within his unit. Expanding it to adjacent units required reporting it up the command hierarchy, having it evaluated at a level sufficiently senior to authorize force-wide adoption, and then distributing it back down through the same hierarchy that had just evaluated it. The process worked for large-scale procurement decisions made months or years in advance of the campaign they were intended for. It worked poorly for tactical innovations that needed to be implemented in weeks. The American Army had Bradley watching a demonstration and ordering immediate production. The difference in process was the difference between a solution that reached 3 out of 5 tanks in 3 weeks and a solution that sat in a procurement chain until the campaign it was supposed to address was over. The Cullen Cutter was also, in a specific sense, a product of the American relationship between officers and enlisted men that differed from the German model. The German Army was an institution built on clear distinctions between the professional officer corps and the enlisted ranks, distinctions of education, authority, and access to command that made it structurally difficult for an idea originating at the enlisted level to reach senior officers quickly. German NCOs were valued and capable. The German Feldwebel was among the most effective non-commissioned officers in any army. But the cultural and institutional channel through which an enlisted man's idea could reach a general in 3 days was narrower in the German army than in the American one. Kulin brought his prototype to his officers. His officers brought it to their superiors. Bradley heard about it and asked to see it. The chain from sergeant to army commander took days, not weeks. The chain worked because the American military culture of the Second World War, for all its institutional friction and bureaucratic tendency, had preserved a quality of pragmatic openness to good ideas from unexpected sources that the specific pressure of the Normandy campaign had activated. The enemy's steel turned against the enemy's terrain by an army that listened to its own sergeants. The field outside St. Lo on July 25, 1944, where the first Rhino tanks pushed through the bocage banks and the German defenders saw something they had not seen and had not prepared for. That field was where the Normandy campaign ended and the liberation of France began. It was also where a Tennessee hillbilly's offhand remark, received with laughter and then with silence, produced the thing that armies are built to produce and rarely do: the right answer, at the right moment, made in time. A sergeant had heard what no one else heard in a field in Normandy. The war heard it too.